Welcome. Welcome, everyone. We are so glad you're here. We're here today with thanks to Sojourners for their ongoing Bridging Divides conversation series. This is a virtual pastoral dialogue designed to support faith leaders navigating complexity, polarization, and moral courage in this moment. Today's Bridging Divides topic is called Beyond Representation, Belonging, and Power in AAPI Churches, and we will explore how AAPI congregations, particularly those shaped by majority ethnic dynamics, are navigating questions of hegemony, belonging, and shared leadership across lines of difference. In a time when so many communities are being asked to carry more while being heard less, the church is called to become a place of deeper truth, courage, and belonging. Together, we'll explore what it means to move beyond visibility alone and toward real belonging, shared leadership, and faithful power in AAPI faith communities. We want to name the challenges AAPI Christians face, reflect on the gifts and wisdom they bring, and imagine what becomes possible when churches do more than include people at the margins, but when they help build communities where those voices help lead and shape and transform the whole body. I'm really grateful to be joined by Reverend Lydia Shiu, pastor and director of social justice and action at Reservoir Church, and Reverend David Chang, who is the pastor at Open Door Presbyterian Church. In conversation today, we're hoping to create a space that's both pastoral and prophetic for honest reflection, theological grounding, and practical wisdom for leaders discerning how to lead faithfully in this season. I want to make a request for all listening to give our speakers grace as they share. Though each of us are faith leaders in our own ways, in our own communities, we want to show up today as fellow human beings, grappling and making meaning of what it means to be in community. And it might not be perfect and polished, but we will be authentic and real. My name is Nina Fernando. I serve as the executive director of the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign. We envision a more pluralistic and inclusive United States where all people, regardless of their faith or background, are treated respectfully and fairly and with dignity. We connect and we equip and we mobilize faith communities in the United States to address the problem of anti-Muslim discrimination among many different forms of bigotry. And really, it's an expression of our faith to be in solidarity. In my role, I think about building belonging and power, not just within our churches, but beyond them, extending towards our neighbors of other faiths and cultural backgrounds in partnerships and collaborations and coalitions beyond ourselves. Particularly in Christian communities in the United States, love of God is professed, while sometimes intentional relationships across difference fail to occur. So I'm here as your moderator today with thanks to the invitation from Sojourners. And just to share a note about my personal upbringing, I come from a Sri Lankan Catholic family. So I want to turn to our speakers, Lydia and David. Before we get into the questions, share a little bit about yourself and the communities that you lead.
I can go first. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Nice to be with you all. My name is Lydia Shiu. I am a pastor at a church called Reservoir Church. It's in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Reservoir is a church that started about 25 years ago as originally a vineyard, one of the vineyard networks, then transitioned through like LGBT affirmation and things like that about 10 years ago. And I've been at this church for about 8 years. It's kind of like a post-evangelical and charismatic roots, pretty casual church. We actually don't wear collars or a lot of like garb. I wear t-shirts sometimes, um, and things like that. So that's kind of my background and kind of the ministry context that I'm in. My title is Director of Social Justice and Action. And I also do some overseeing of the family's ministries, as well as just regular preaching and teaching and things like that. We do a lot of community organizing through the social justice and putting our faith into action work that we do at our church. And those are some of my favorite things to do in the church. I personally am a Korean American, grew up I was born in Korea and came to the United States when I was 9 years old, but I've moved around from Kansas to Georgia and California, and now I am in very cold Boston. We're just starting to experience spring, so I'm very grateful for that.
David, you're muted.
Can you hear
There we
me?
go.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Sorry. Hi, everybody. My name is David Chang. I'm the senior pastor at Open Door Presbyterian Church in Northern Virginia. We are a predominantly Asian American, Korean American congregation, about 90%, and then would be Pan-Asian, and we've got a growing Indian immigrant population that's starting to attend our church. Our community happens to be around a lot of refugee folks that are coming in from various different places of the world, and so we've had the privilege of being able to interact and walk alongside of these folks. Our church is unique in that we have an interdependent model where we choose to be in the same campus with a Korean speaking congregation. And so we are two households, one family. That's what we call ourselves. I'm personally from Chicago, is what I tell folks. I grew up since high school. But prior to that, I was born in Korea, moved to Bangladesh when I was one. My parents are still missionaries there and grew up in Bangladesh, went to India to go to boarding school, and then transitioned to Chicago my sophomore year. And then I've been in Chicago, been in Virginia, in San Diego, and then back in Virginia, where I am currently. And I've been at Open Door now for the past decade or so. And again, I serve as the lead pastor here.
Amazing. Now that I read through my intro, now I can just talk and not be reading. I am so amazed to learn of your backgrounds. Just even hearing this little bit. I, by the way, come from, I mentioned a Sri Lankan Catholic background, born and raised in Southern California. I think one of the ways in which I grew up, my mother taught us about our Sri Lankan culture in Sri Lankan community through the lived tradition of Catholicism. And I kind of being born and raised here had that both and experience, that in between experience of feeling both as if I was fully and also not enough. And then at the same time navigated and understood a faith throughout the years in my studies, studying religion, world religions, interreligious studies, and living at the intersection of faith and justice and coming together across difference. So that's a little bit about what brings me into this conversation. So I want to just kind of big picture ask, and Lydia, I'll ask you this: how has your faith shaped the way you respond to difference, especially when it feels unfamiliar and uncomfortable?
Thanks, Nina. I grew up as a pastor's kid, so faith has definitely shaped me, faith and church life. And I grew up predominantly Korean American churches. So my father was, a pastor of a Korean church, Korean speaking congregation. And and at the same time, I grew up in places where there weren't that many Asian people, like Georgia and Kansas, right after being transported from Korea. And so I definitely had the feeling of being a stranger, someone who is not familiar to them. And I felt very different in Georgia and Kansas. And but then within the church, I was, at home. I was one of them. Everybody looked like me. We ate, Korean food that makes you feel a certain way. And so I don't know, it was kind of like a whiplash of an experience. And so I can be very comfortable and familiar in one setting, and then also very unfamiliar and uncomfortable in another setting. And at the same time, as I've gotten older, that feeling also switched, where I became more Americanized or international or just more comfortable in settings where everybody's different. For example, in Kansas, some of my best friends were Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laos because there's a big Vietnamese, Laos, and Cambodian population as opposed to Korean in Kansas. And so I love that, being with different kinds of people. And then um, in the Korean church, I would actually feel like, okay, I'm starting to forget my Korean. I am not doing the things in a Korean way that made me kind of outcasted sometimes, especially as a pastor's kid, when you're supposed to be the perfect kind of the right way to do certain things in that context. So, I mean, yeah, I would say, of course, faith shapes me, but also my experiences in the world has shaped me and vice versa. And I find myself like in in contexts where I'm like, if I'm completely safe and if I'm completely only familiar and comfortable, then actually that's not a place that I want to be. Um, I I've really enjoyed meeting different people all throughout my life that are very, very different from me. And in fact, like, when I got into hip hop in college, I was like, oh my gosh, like, how does hip hop speak to this Korean American like so much deeper than K-pop, I guess, at the time, because I was more comfortable with English. And that actually like alivened something else in me, the difference. Of course, the Black American experience is very different from mine, but I don't know, it just did something to me. And so for me, I love being in relationship with people who are different, and it does cause for sometimes more conflict at times. And I think it's hard to do church in a very multi-ethnic, you know, way. People say like Sunday morning is one of the most segregated times in America because we all go to churches that feel safe and comfortable. But I think, one of our calling in faith is to kind of push beyond that and get uncomfortable and reach out to the outskirts and reach out across boundaries and our comfortability. And, that's kind of what we're trying to do constantly. And yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking about when you ask that question.
Yeah. So interesting. I really resonate with this piece around uh, getting uncomfortable and that being a place where you find value and even perhaps faith and meaning. David, I want to ask you, where have you had to unlearn or reimagine theology in order to lead more faithfully?
Hmm. You know, it's interesting, even if as I hear from Lydia, so I grew up, like I said, most of my childhood as a missionary kid, and, and as an MK. And one of the things that I think about is, in a developing country, Westerners, it doesn't matter if you're Asian American or if you're Caucasian, Westerners are viewed with a different lens. They're viewed as people with resources, with a certain level of professionalism, and all of that translates to power and influence. And so, as much as we go in with faith and compassion and justice, there's always a power dynamic that's at play. Now, growing up, I didn't really realize what that was. I just thought, that's just how it is. I look different, I smell different. Obviously, I eat different kinds of food. But it wasn't until I started going into ministry that I started to realize, it's interesting. The theology that we need to unlearn isn't necessarily so much to do with the differences with our culture and our background, but oftentimes it has to do with our relationship with power, how we understand power. Because I think part of the dynamics and the struggles coming to the States is identity is often tied with how much leverage and power we have, right? So who we relate with, who we're friends with, what kind of folks that we associate with, it gives a certain amount of power. Interestingly now, here in Northern Virginia, it's like the hottest thing to be Korean American. Actually, it might be across the country with all the K-pop music and the Korean drama. People eat Korean food. You can buy Korean food at Costco. My kids, I have a 16-year-old and a 15-year-old. They're not ashamed to take Korean food to school for their lunches. I mean, for me, that would have been unthinkable. And I think part of that has to do with the shifting in influence when it comes to social spaces. So, all that to say, when I think about how theology, things I've had to unlearn, it's not so much the doctrines. I really do feel like it has to do with the power dynamics, how churches hold and understand influence and power, how we utilize that when it comes to our identity and our cultural heritage, who we choose to associate with and who we don't, and how that engagement happens in our context within the community itself.
So interesting. Yeah, I totally resonate with that. You know, when we're thinking about particularly AAPI faith communities, and even when we're thinking about our churches, our faith experiences, and not just within a particular ethnic group, but also across. Um, uh, they're not a monolith. And each of your churches, for example, are very different, I would imagine. And there's a spectrum of, people coming across with experience from ethnicity, with language, class, political orientations, generations, immigration stories. So how do you navigate those differences? How do you understand them? I would even say when it comes to belonging and exclusion, or even when it comes to power, as you named that, how do you navigate those tensions? And both of you, whoever would like to jump in.
I think for us at our church, one of the things that we had to come to terms with is the hegemony that's present within a predominantly Asian American, again, 90% culturally Korean American congregation. Now, in Northern Virginia, because of our proximity to DC, socioeconomically, I would say we're probably upper middle class, folks that are very highly educated, people that are working in the federal government spaces. And so, even when it comes to status, as the predominant cultural group, it's very easy to become like comfortable with this is how things are. This is how things are going to have to happen. And so I think for us, one of the first things that we had to do with is, again, do a spiritual audit, is what we call it, about 10 years or so ago. Asking some of these questions that we have to wrestle with is what are some of the norms that are communicated without being communicated? Folks that are on the margins would be able to say, hey, things are kind of weird, but for the majority of us, we're just like, this is just how it is. These are how things happen. And so just having to a conversation to say, here's things that we take for granted. Here's just these are obvious to us, were some of these conversations that helped us get that first foot into the door step for us to be able to navigate. No, there's actually a lot of differences here, even within the Korean American context, about how people engage with their world and context and society. And I mean, we're not even talking about different life stages, right? And so people with children, people who are empty nesting, those who are single. And so it's just, again, developing what is the predominant voice? What are the cultural norms that are being exercised without us being intentional about them? And then being able to say, what shapes those norms? What are the assumptions that come behind the shaping of those? And at our church, we call them the centers. What are the centers that, good or bad, that shape who we are?
I feel like also your identity, your story of being Korean, growing up in Bangladesh and studying in India and then coming to the US, like even that in and of itself might inform the ways in which you engage, in those kinds of conversations. Lydia, what are your thoughts? How have you navigated this? How do you minister to it?
Yeah, I'm really glad to be hearing like conversations about power and kind of what is the centering or the dominant, thing because that's really what sets the tone. And everything else kind of, gets excluded and forgotten and, no one cares about. And so I think that naturally happens in a predominantly Korean church or predominantly, or like a predominantly white church or multi-ethnic church. There's always like some kind of norm and dominance that happens. And I think yeah, like pushing that and saying like being aware of that. I agree with you, David. Like really, doing a evaluation of what are those things and then how can we push against them and be aware of them. I think are for sure really helpful. I mean, for me, like in the process trying to kind of push that, I think it's helped for our church context. It's like it's 60% white and 20% black and 20% Asian, I'd say. Um, and also, we have like people who are, we're in the same area code as Harvard and MIT, and there's really a lot of highly educated people all condensed into a small area. And at the same time, there's a lot of working class people as well who are, contractors and like, and there's all different kinds of people that come. And I think it's always trying to center and like decenter those things and kind of playing with those pieces and getting the people who don't have as much power like handing the microphone to them and sharing those stories. And so I we, during like especially during like leadership kind of recruitment season at the beginning of the ministry year, or like we're recruiting for the board, I'm like going through a list of people who I've been like eyeing that haven't been anywhere in the realm of being a board member at an organization before, like who might not have the depth and breadth of like experience of leading an organization or whatever, but also like they're movers and shakers in their community in their own right. And so kind of handpicking certain people to like really bring them forward and center them, handing the mic to them and saying, what do you want to say? Like, what are you interested in? Um, and in doing so, I think it makes for an environment that actually causes more misunderstanding because you're not all sharing the same norms because you're not talking the same way. You're not using the same lingo or same vocabulary. So you might have more misunderstanding and more conflict in your board meeting. If you have a mix of people who are like culturally so different. But I think that's where the beauty comes in, and it makes things for sometimes not efficient or productive but really rich and like really authentic. And really, even if things move like slower because we're not all, tech savvy and, have all logged onto the Google Docs, if it's, someone who they don't respond to emails, you only have to call them, like literally call them. Difference of small, like tiny cultures like that, I think actually makes a huge difference to make those jump and to make the space for the people to come forward and come to the center and speak up. I'm also
So,
looking at some of the chats.
yeah, so a question on that, and this is just based on what you both have shared when it comes to centering. Um, how do you navigate if you have ever experienced pushback on that when a voice that is not reflective of the majority is shaping or naming something that feels uncomfortable, to bring up that theme before, how do you navigate that? And then the second of it is we've all in broader communities experience, or I'll speak for myself, have experienced the difference of being kind of visible, but not yet necessarily actually belonging, not being included. And, like there's tokenization, there's all those kinds of dynamics that have made it challenging. So how do you navigate both of that? The pushback, perhaps, the tension, the when a voice is not reflective of the majority, and then find the other piece around like not falling to, we need this diverse voice. Let's bring them in, but not in a real authentic way.
Yeah, I
I
think,
think oh, go ahead. Mhm.
thanks, David. I think it's just real hard work, and for me to fight something like tokenism is friendship, like real relationship, like ask about each other's, not just at like a meeting or a function, but, just friendship, spending time with them and, sitting next to them, getting into their elbows and their shoulders, and being with each other's bodies. And um, I think the relationship that goes that much deeper can that can cover for so much more, that you understand each other better, you get, you've been to their house, you get where they're, what they're worried about. And I have a friend, I have these two friends that I really look up to. It's a black woman and a Korean guy, a Korean American guy, dynamic duo who is like filmmakers, and they make documentaries and do podcasts, and they're just like really two creative people. But their collaboration has like inspired me, and I did like a podcast interview of them one time, and they just went on and on about the word oneness. And I was like, yes, yeah, that's like yes, of course, like a theological, I am one, with my God, with my Father, with me, and you are one with me. I'm like, yes, but they just kept talking about oneness, oneness, oneness. And I was like, yeah, as I'm hearing them constantly just say the word oneness, I'm like, yeah, I don't know that I feel oneness with all the people that are making me feel uncomfortable or pushing me or challenges. And so they really challenge me to think about, what does it really mean to have oneness with someone else who might be very different from me, and to how to move towards that with such like conviction and commitment over time, when the conflict comes up, when it gets hard. And so those are some of the things that I think about, like oneness, in all the different, across like different experiences and cultures, and conflict again and again, like oneness, oneness.
That's a beautiful invitation and preach, Lydia, in terms of oneness, but also um, relationships being the invitation, essentially. David, what are your thoughts on all of this?
So I think we struggle. And if we're honest, especially in my church's context, we don't have to deal with it too much because, again, we're about 90% Korean American. And so I think one of the ways that we challenge it, for us, centering is one of the ways that we identify how the norm happens and the hegemony of like this is the predominant culture takes place. And so the way in which we challenge the church actually is to really think theologically, outside of the center. So the language that we use is we're not center out, but actually more margins in, outside in. So what that means for us is, we can just be so comfortable with our center. And we ironically have a lot of oneness because we all kind of sound the same, look the same, share similar socioeconomic backgrounds. We have very few folks that challenge that norm. And that's something that we're constantly thinking through. But because of that, it's easy for us to say, well, we do acts of justice and compassion, and we go out into places that are different from us, and we do that. But eventually we come back to our centers, which are our safe spaces. And we're good with it, we're comfortable with that. And so the way in which we challenge tokenism, that we challenge different thoughts is, you know, Christ actually has always been the opposite, right? He's challenging centers, he's challenging the norms. He's in places of margins and marginalization, which is ironically one of the reasons why the Pharisees and the Sadducees are upset at him in the first place. What are you doing in Galilee and these kinds of folks, and not in the centers of Jerusalem teaching in the synagogues? And so if we were to really re-understand what that looks like for us as a church, then we can't operate from center out. What does it look like for me and our congregation to say, well, Christ is already in the margins, inviting us outside of our centers. So then how does that change the way in which we relate with our communities? How does that change the way in which we relate with power and the dynamics of power? We do a lot of compassion work with the unhoused, again, as I mentioned, with the immigrants, those that are refugees. But if it's center out, then we can do something really good and then return back and not much changes. But if it really is margins in, then what does it look like for us to have relationship with people that are different? Not just, culturally, but socioeconomically. How do we relate with our neighbors? And that's been one of the key ways that we've been trying to move the needle. Because I think the reality is in our context, because of our relationship with the first generation Korean speaking congregation, it'll be really hard for us to overnight become a multi-ethnic congregation with lots of different cultures. And I'm not even sure if that's the end goal for us. But if we're faithful to how God is calling us outside of our centers, then how does that change the dynamics of not just who we are, but the way in which we relate and how we operate? Because fundamentally, I think that's been the biggest shift for us. Not just let's do something compassionate and justice oriented and then return back to who we are and be okay with the predominant cultural norms. But if we were to fundamentally think, no, Christ is always calling us from where we are to where he is, and this preference to the suffering, to the marginalized, to those that are hurting, those that are ignored, those that are becoming erased in our cultures, then what does that mean for people who, again, find ourselves to be the majority? What does our relationship with power look like? And so that's been the challenge for us, really.
So interesting. I like a follow-up question to that is how do you navigate the tension of and this might also be a dynamic generationally too in a multi-generational setting the tensions between preserving culture as well as transforming culture the
That's so good.
like the because as you mentioned the center out versus the out coming in um how do you navigate those tensions? Because there is an element where you are changed in going outward or bringing in as well as this desire to preserve culture, especially you mentioned how it's changed when it comes with language, when it comes to um everything. Raising your children in this environment in this time.
So for us, we've had a shifting in relationship when it comes to what foot do we lead with. I think a lot of Asian American, at least in my experience, a lot of Asian American context, we tend to lean first with our culture to say, this is who we are, this is who we've been, these are our traditions, our language, our food. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but one of the challenges, especially as we navigate the world that is changing, third, fourth, fifth generation, we lead with culture or tradition, let me just say tradition. There seems to be certain limitations to, well, it doesn't fit or we're losing it. There's a threatening or like a sense to preserve at all cost. But one of the ways that we've been challenging our folks is instead of leading with tradition, what happens when we start leading with mission, right? So the calling for us, again, that language of instead of center out, which is tradition, comfort, familiarity, and then you go out into the unknown world, to this margins in. So Christ is already there. He's inviting us to leave our center to go, and we lead with that. Then the conversation starts to shift to, well, then okay, we have this mission. How does our tradition and our culture actually help us do that better? So it doesn't become necessarily a threat or a changing landscape, but this is who we are. We have a very unique relationship to the margins. We have a very unique immigrant story. And if the mission and the vision is to leave that center, to go to places of suffering, of marginalization, then how does the tradition help us do that in a unique sense? And that's fundamentally changed the way we look at how culture is changing, traditions are changing. Not so much of a threat. I mean, although there still are many challenges there to it, but the language has shifted more to how do we utilize some of the unique giftings of immigrant communities in meeting the needs of margins. And it's been that first step instead of let's preserve what we have here so we don't lose it. And so it's interesting. We don't emphasize a lot of Korean language at our church. We have a lot of first generation folks saying, how come you don't teach Korean? And part of our answer has been, we're not a cultural center, we're a church. And we're going to communicate in the language that we feel the most effective to meet that mission. Now, being multilingual actually helps us do that work much more effectively. And our kids are multilingual now. Not only do they speak Korean, but they speak Spanish, they speak Chinese. And so how do we lean into that? And so that's been one of the primary ways that we've been navigating that. It's a different relationship between what we consider to be traditional or traditions and culture to what is the calling and the mission that we feel like God is doing, and what foot do we lean with, and then how do we see that culture and tradition actually helps us do it better.
Hmm. So interesting. And Lydia, to bring you in, and kind of drawing in a question that was raised, how do you navigate these kinds of tensions and even conflict in a multicultural congregation when different segments of your community, for example, have different understandings of not only their faith, but also the ways in which they orient towards conflict, the ways in which um, they're thinking about the work of building belonging, or this piece around centering and marginality, all of that.
Yeah, it's definitely it's like as I'm hearing David too, like I'm thinking about two different contexts though. I'm thinking about my church that's like multi-ethnic, but also like predominantly white, even though it's it is like truly multi-ethnic, and also like a Korean church context. So I think like where you start definitely is like it's different. The context that you start with is different because in a in a church that's predominant, actually. I've seen this actually this other model where it didn't go well, but it was a series of models that I heard about, may or may not be locally, um, where there were some people that came together to do a church plan, but the church plan model was a white pastor and a Korean, because there are a lot of Koreans love Jesus, um, as you can see, uh, an Asian American kind of associate pastor, and that happened like multiple sites, and it worked really well at first. Um, because it had kind of the friendship that started and the diversity that kind of is the impetus for the foundation of the church, a white guy and Asian guy, starting it up. But also it became problematic over time as well because it was the white guy was the head and the associate was the Asian sidekick. And so it didn't go well when the church started growing with, a lot of Asian people and they were serving bibimbap and stuff like that at some point. And then at some point it got bigger and more multi-ethnic. And there was kind of this like uh transition and a request to stop serving bibimbap after church every Sunday. And that got weird and it just kind of transitions. Um, so for me in the multi-ethnic context, um, how you truly have power, how you truly have representation that's beyond just visibility, but actually like having power, get those people into the top of the leadership and pay them. Fund them, you know? One
So
of the,
true.
I feel like one of the best moves that Reservoir made was we had a senior pastor who's a white guy, and there's a white woman and myself. But one of the best moves we made was we hired an executive pastor who's really kind of I see her as like a more like a co-pastor of our senior pastor. So executive pastor was hired this black woman who's been a longtime member of our church, a great friend of the church, a leader of the church. She's, led the woman of color community group for years. And she's a top leader. She makes calls now and she is paid to do so. And so really like that's not tokenism. That's real power, at the top of the leadership and paying them to do that. And so that's for me, that's what I would want to see if we're really trying to bring the outskirts to the center and say power. money is powerful. I mean, even within the church, it can elevate them so much. We've also like funded, a woman of color retreat, let them take over the whole church and do a whole retreat just for them. Like we haven't done that for other groups. Um, but it was important, and for the queer community group, giving them funding to do something extraordinary, like a little something extra for them, like we can do that, like the budget speaks when we're trying to actually exercise belonging. So those are my two.
That is a very profound point about budget and and how that is a very I think that that dynamic happens when it comes to youth and youth programming. There's this so I don't different churches have different ways, but sometimes that is undervalued and it's volunteer based versus paid and that
10-hour part-time and then handle all this though.
sure, sure. And I really think that's important. How like, can you tell us more about how you have navigated pushback? When it comes to any of this, any of these themes that we're discussing, how do you minister? How do you what kind of theological grounding? And you gave us some of that, David. But what are some other kind of lessons learned, insights, stories that you could share for people who might be feeling uncomfortable? And going back to that how Lydia, you feel you didn't comfort was not the word that you used, but you I can't remember what word you used to say that that's where you're drawn to those spaces of feeling uncomfortable. What about people who aren't there and also who understandably have faced discomfort in their day-to-day lives and they come on Sunday, for example, or throughout the week to take a break and to not feel the feelings that they feel externally outside of the walls of the communities that you create. And I think about elders, I really do, and how at least in my tradition, we honor our elders just as much as our elders have some trauma, have some challenges that are unique to their generation.
I can take a stab at that. I think it's not easy, would be the first way to share. I'll give you a practical example. So, as I mentioned at our church, we have this interdependent relationship with the Korean-speaking congregation and the English-speaking congregation. The Korean-speaking congregation are the first generation, is what we typically call them. And so these are folks that immigrated from the United States when they were much older and had kids that were here. And we make up the second generation. Now, our English-speaking congregation, I'd say now we've transitioned from the second to the third and the fourth generation. And so the norms of even between the first, second, and third, the norms are very different, right? What's comfortable, what's normative, whether that's theologically, culturally, so on and so forth. And so even just, 5 or 6 years ago, when some of the BLM things were happening in our area, the second and third generation, our English speaking congregation, we decided, hey, we're going to actually, in solidarity, walk with a bunch of churches in our city. We're going to go on a peace walk with an African American church. We had a Caucasian church. We were the Asian church, a couple of others that we decided to walk through our city. Now, our first generation has a very painful relationship, well, not all of them, but with the LA riots, with some of the rioting that happened in Baltimore City, predominantly with African American communities that were the perpetrators against the first generation Asian American communities. And so they have this very visceral reaction and memories of being wronged and hurt by particular groups. And so just the fact that we were walking, and it wasn't necessarily a particular agenda, it was a peace and prayer, solidarity conversation. It was very rubbing folks at the wrong way, people having some really hard conversations about like, what is it that you guys are standing for? How do we navigate this? What's happening to the second, third, fourth generation? They were not easy conversations to have. And I think part of is us having to put ourselves in their shoes, in their experience. Again, I mean, my parents went through the war in Korea, and that's a very different understanding of upbringing and how that colors the way they see the world and how they engage with the rest of the world. And so, yeah, I think they weren't easy, but again, one of the ways that we navigated through that is speaking not necessarily through here's tradition and what's right, but really the mission of what it is that we're trying to do. So at our church, we talk a lot about being missional. We talk a lot about being community facing. We use words like renewal and restoration. That's at the forefront of a lot of what we say and what we do. And bringing that back to, hey, we get it. It's uncomfortable. We understand from your perspective that this is not easy. There's a lot of hurt for us to work through. But again, God calls us to be a particular type of people, and quite honestly, to be a church that makes a difference in the world in regards to renewal and restoration. And so, not undermining and brushing under the rug, but how do we reclaim and really make real some of the hurt and challenges? But go beyond some of those things to be able to meet the folks where they are now, to be able to be folks that are going to be there when there are in need. And so, again, I mean, we've had conversations with folks that didn't end well. We've had ongoing talks with people that were still in disagreements with things. And I'm sure we're not the only ones, whether it's with Lydia, with Nina, with yourself, the political climate that we find ourselves to be in, there's always going to be someone that's like, hey, I don't like this. There's a threat to that. But for us, what's always been the standard has been, look, this is what our mission is. And internally, I have something that we say that's kind of tongue in cheek. We say our job as pastors and staff at our church is to offend everybody. That's just the way that we do it is we want to offend the left, we want to offend the right, because if we're not, then we're leaning to one particular side of the power spectrum. We
Did you
want
say
to
offend or defend?
offend.
Offend. Hmm.
Yes. Yeah,
Hmm.
we want to be offensive to everybody. And so in some ways, I think yeah, it's not easy. And again, I think a lot of this conversation, it depends on the context, but for
Yeah.
us, the leading foot has been let's really try to bring this down to not undermining the reality of your pain and disagreements. And the honestly, it is scary to face change and cultural differences, and we acknowledge that. And I think one of the things that we tell our staff a lot is, if we lead with, I'm doing this well, what's wrong with you? I don't know. There's a certain disconnect, I think, to that because, to be honest, I don't do it very well. I have a particular group of people that I'm comfortable with, ways in which, even with my upbringing, and people call me a third culture kid, right? And so I have all kinds of things with culture, but even I don't deal with that well. I don't do well with, being outside of my cultural norms and familiarities, but constantly reorienting. Okay, if it's not center out but margins in, then how does that change? And what is our relationship with that? And so that's been one of the main ways that we've been navigating some of the tensions in our context.
So interesting. Lydia, do you have thoughts on any of that or any in your own context about navigating tensions, discomfort, um, pushback, essentially, pushback on some of these themes about belonging
Yeah, as I'm
and power?
sitting here, I think I'm really glad that both David and I are here because again, like the context where it starts out is like totally different conversation. Um, and some of the things that we're discussing about like, what does it mean to have like belonging and like representation and diversity and things like that. I think for a racially ethnic specific church and then a multi-ethnic church or a white dominant church, it's just two different conversations.
It is.
Because
It
I
really
mean,
is.
I can see how for David at a Korean church, like belonging is doing really well because it's a Korean church that went full of immigrants who have not felt belonging, as immigrants maybe. But they have that belonging to one another. And like what a beautiful, powerful place. And like the black churches, like you see black churches, you're like, dang, they got their thing, and it's like it's beautiful. And also like when church should churches I think like David alluded to it earlier, like is it the goal to be more diverse or not? I don't know. Like one of the ways that I see kind of like, oh, how can diversity happen and or whatever? I think like people who have traditionally have had power for hundreds and thousands of years need to come under the leadership of people so for example, like if there's a Asian church that's trying to reach out and stuff, I think like there should be more white people joining the church, to like, and learn and get taught, you know, and the diversity, like diversity only happens when that power thing that David mentioned in the beginning, like power dynamic changes. So who is speaking from the front? Who is being taught? Who is learning? Who is hunched over and humbled and like receiving? And who is like offering and teaching and sharing from a place of power? And even when we talk about like mission, it's like it for so long, like sorry, no calm to you, David. I just have some triggers around even the word mission. It's like it has, I mean, maybe you do too, like you're a missionary, okay? But it's like it often has come from a place of power to like help, to give help, you know? And so to really like actually dig into the flipping that power and talking about, diversity and belonging, it's like two different conversations. And there are some times where belonging is really, really needed. And then and safety is really, really needed. And then there are sometimes some people need to be more uncomfortable and more unfamiliar, and some people need more familiar and more comfortable. And I really struggle with the two different places because actually it's the in between those two places where I find myself. A few 10 years ago, I started this thing called Progressive Asian American Christians because I was meeting so many Asian Americans who didn't feel, maybe because of some of the things that David mentioned about his church in the Korean context, discomfort around, BLM or social or political ideologies, or even a theological, maybe progressive theology that didn't jive well with the Korean immigrant church that has been, cocooned and set in a certain ways, maybe might have been set and stagnant the year they immigrated, which can happen because they're safe and they're, in their safe place. But a lot of the Asian Americans that like grew up in those churches felt like they grew out of that. But then they couldn't find a church where they can be really seen, really belong at a progressively or liberal theological mainline churches. They didn't belong. They didn't see themselves. They weren't really seen. They were tokenized and just treated as like, oh, like welcome, really, really great, nice church people, but really not seeing me as who I am. And so that's why I was like looking for like the gap between those two places and going, what are we doing? How like are we, what are the in-between spaces? And some of them, a lot of them just stopped going to churches. So yeah, I think this conversation is so hard because the context is so different for what we're trying to do with diversity and equity and shared representation and leadership at a multi-ethnic church. And then there's like Asian churches that are thriving and creating the spaces, but also like they feel maybe some Asian people don't feel belonging in the sense of like theologically or politically or socially. So I think it is such a challenging place and lots of misunderstanding. Lots of misunderstanding just happens over and over and over again. And I think that makes it really hard.
I mean, even as you're processing all of this, I resonate with what you're saying. It's making so, it makes so much sense. In all of the messiness of it. I am mindful of time. I there's so much. I feel like I have so many questions for both of you. I'm so fascinated by all that you shared and have learned quite a bit. And just thinking ahead, I'm a mother. I have two kids that are young, 3 and 5, sweet ages. And I wonder, as just thinking ahead, and the cultural context and the moment that we're in here in the United States and globally, the next generation, young people navigating multiple identities, all of that. What do you imagine for their future and for the future of the church?
For
Or
me,
even hope for. You can even say what you hope.
yeah, no, one of the things, and again, I agree and appreciate everything, Lydia, you're sharing, because I do think, one of the challenges of conversations like this about belonging, cultural identity, it is so nuanced, right? But the reason I keep coming down to power and the surrender of that power, ironically, in a place where everyone already feels like they're the majority, the same dynamics that you might feel in a multi-ethnic context is what we struggle with because we've now become the majority that's in power. And so, what does it look like for us to surrender that? And what does it look like for us to engage with other cultural backgrounds and nuances and so on and so forth? So again, all that to say, I definitely appreciate the struggle. When I think about the next generation, though, and this is something for me, as much as I've grown up as a believer pretty much since the womb, because I felt like I didn't really much have a choice, my parents being the way that they are. One thing I realized when I came to the States is I don't know if I really know what it means to be Asian and Christian at the same time. I know what it means to be Asian and majority Christian culture, as in like white adjacent, like this is what Christianity has been told. But I don't know if I necessarily know what it means to be Korean or Korean Indian and Christian at the same time. And so, what I really hope for, and I'm excited about the next generation, is that if we lead with, here's who Christ is, that our culture is not detrimental, but it allows us to do it even better. Then one of the hopes for me is when I look at my children, is that, man, your unique cultural identity, it's not something that you have to assimilate to something else. This is what makes you good at what Christ has called you to do in the renewal and the restoration of this world. And so what I'm really excited about is what makes us unique, what unique giftings give us as Korean Americans for in my context that help me bring about this renewal and restoration, and how can the next generation live unashamed with that and just really just begin to scratch the surface. Because again, I don't think we know. We've kind of been playing this role of pretending like we know, but what gets me really excited is once we unlock, man, people saying, "Wow, man, my culture isn't a detriment; it's actually an additive to how God has called me." Then I think we're just now starting to see, the potential for, Asian Americans and Korean Americans, what we can do for the kingdom of God. I really don't think we are even starting to see the thing. And if I can say it because we're here and based on this context, I really do think the calling is for immigrant and non-majority cultures to take the lead. I do believe that in the next generation, that the way that you're seeing the global trend of Christianity as well, it's going to be the South, global South. It's going to be different cultures and different backgrounds, different norms that take the forefront. And here in the United States, I do believe that that's going to be a critical role that we play for the Big C Church.
And we need it. We need that shift. Lydia, please.
100% agree. And you did say the word, we don't have to assimilate, the word assimilate, because for me, my hope is based on a book that I love called Unassimilable, an
Mhm.
Asian Diasporic Manifesto for the 21st Century. It's by Bianca Mabuti Louis, and she lays out a plan how Asians cannot just be like assimilating, but really, like David said, lead. And I think that's what we need to do, like be brazen Asian. Don't just, and we don't need to assimilate, be ourselves like our ancestry, our tradition, like make it Christian. Be a modern day theologian where you make it Christian. Think about Chi as Holy Spirit. That's okay. It's not heresy. You know, eat rice and soju for communion instead of bread and juice or wine. That's okay. That's not heresy. That's Asians like traditions and elements reclaiming like Christian faith and Christian spiritual practices. That's okay. Make it yours, and make it and it's going to be powerful. It is powerful. I've seen it. People really like taking pride in that. And so I that's what I want to see.
I love that. So beautiful. You know, my parents named me Nina, and part of that was as new immigrants wanting us to assimilate, if you will.
Totally.
And and I have mixed babies, and we made the decision we wanted them to hold on to that identity and know about that identity as well. And we gave them South Asian names. And so I really I hear what you're saying. It's like own where your stories, your ancestors, your traditions, your history, and bring those gifts. I love that. Bring those gifts out into the world to enhance, to change, to shape the future. So thank you both. I can tell why and how you are pastors of thriving communities. I've learned so much from you, and thank you, Sojourners, for creating this space and inviting us into conversation with each other. Who would I would not have been able to meet you if it wasn't for you, Sojourners. So thank you, and more soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Glad to be here.